Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, September 1st, 2021. Time for another month. I forgot to say that in the Morning Post. Time for another show. That, I guess, I did take care of by virtue of the fact that there was a Morning Post. There wasn't one yesterday. A little bit reminiscent of Groundhog Day there. I don't know what happened to yesterday's post. I absolutely remember drafting it, and I sort of remember scheduling it. But it wasn't in my drafts folder, and it wasn't on the Kagro in the Morning group page at Daily Kos either. I was reliably informed, and I don't know what happened. So we didn't have the post. But as you know, of course, if you're a regular listener to the show, that's probably happened to you once or twice before. And if you panic and go to the previous days or any day's morning post and click on that link, it's the same link. It'll bring you to the same stream. And I guess that calls into question what I do, why I do this every morning, and, just dedication to the show, I guess. Anyway, except for yesterday, in which case there was no live show, but we brought back a rerun. If you got a chance to listen, great. If you didn't, I don't know. You're in trouble with me, I guess. Go listen to it, because it was a very interesting and very old rerun. I went back and I pulled the oldest August 31st show that I could find, which was August 31st, 2012, not 2021, but reversed those last two numbers, 2012. And I guess were we still at the, in 2012, I think we went to the we didn't go to the Republican National Convention, but we were at, I guess, or getting ready to do, or I don't know what the timing was with the Democratic National Convention, but I don't know. I have this feeling that they were nearly simultaneous. They usually don't overlap like that, but I don't know. For some reason, I remember it. But we went to Charlotte, North Carolina for the Democratic Convention, and I went there. It must have been just shortly before then. I don't know. I forget who went first. Although I have this vague memory of being in Charlotte and talking about Clint Eastwood and his infamous, I guess, chair speech where he spoke to an empty chair, like pretending that was President Obama and he was admonishing him or something. I don't know. Early sign of just how crazy Republicans were getting. You may recall, actually, that there was, it's not a credible accusation, but it was an accusation that was widely circulated, even among like normal-ish Republicans. They made it to like the national news that idiot Republicans were saying this. But do you remember that there were accusations that Obama had somehow used government power in some way, military machinery or something, to manipulate the weather during the conventions, whether it was to give himself sunny weather, which I don't even think they really necessarily got. I think the weather was okay in Charlotte, but I guess it rained on the Republican convention. I don't know. I forget exactly what was going on. Or maybe it was supposed to rain in Charlotte, but didn't. I don't know. I can't remember what it was that happened. Only that there were Republicans accusing, like out in the open where everybody could see them, accusing President Obama of manipulating the weather for political purposes. And by the way, you remember how well that worked, right? There were millions of people, I recall, saying I was going to vote for Obama, but the rain or the weather or something, and then I was just angry about him manipulating it, and so therefore I denied him a second term. Didn't work. I don't know. Or maybe it did work because he manipulated the weather, and really he fooled all the sheeple into believing that the weather was actually good for his convention and bad for the Republicans, and that cost him. So they came back in 2016 and said, whatever it takes. I don't know. I'm not certain what was motivated, but that was also another early sign that they were losing their grip on reality. Anyway, this morning we're ready to go. The Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now, actually live again. Thanks, Bill, for taking note of this. Today is the day Kagro X finally admits we'd be better off if the U.S. was run by the Eastern gray squirrels. Is today that day? I think that's the question he's posing here. Eastern gray squirrel. I don't know. We'd have to have a caucus, of course. The Western gray squirrels would want something to say about that. Without even getting into the question of other colors of squirrels, chipmunks might be like, what about us? I don't know. The extreme southwest of the country might have its own input about that. There could be all sorts of ground mammals, tree mammals that have something to say about this. Flying squirrels, of course. And I mean, how far? Here in the Democratic Party, we would throw it open to skunks, coatis, raccoons, you name it. We'd want to have some representation on that. So what can you do? Maybe that will be today. But the other alternative was, will he continue living in denial? You see, they're getting crazy over there among the eastern gray squirrels. Time for the nuts to meet the road. And I'm not sure I like the sound of that. Holy mackerel. Anyway, let's see. It is Wednesday. Greg Dworkin preparing a raft of stories for today. You might need that raft to float away after the hurricane comes through. Although, I guess it moved a lot faster than I thought it was going to. I was under the impression that we weren't going to get the heavy stuff until this afternoon. But I guess we're getting heavy rain. Maybe it's a trailing band of storms that's hitting us. And so the storm's kind of going a little west of Washington, but coming right over our area. Headed out, it'll rain all over Connecticut, I'm sure. But I don't know if the path, brings what was the center of the storm. It's now disorganized. It doesn't have an eye anymore, like Dan Crenshaw, as a matter of fact. But anyway, it's headed out over the northeast to soak us, but it's not nearly as powerful. That's the way of hurricanes. Sometimes they just come up the coast and turn left and hit us straight on, but not this time. New Orleans got it again, and I'm not certain whether we're getting clearer reports on things or not, or whether they just still don't have electricity and it's difficult to report. But drone footage is out there, lots of flooding going on. I don't know. I missed it yesterday because I was otherwise involved, but we're back online to find out what the hell happened yesterday. Today, here's Greg Dworkin to tell us a little bit about it. Good morning, Greg.
Good morning. So, they're still assessing the damage.
Okay.
We got like 5 big stories going on all at the same time. We have, the Ida and its aftermath, and we don't get hit with the heavy rains in Connecticut until tonight.
Okay.
It's raining now, but this is the light stuff. The heavy stuff's tonight. And that's flash flooding on already saturated ground, so we'll see what happens there. Right. So there's Ida. There's Afghan withdrawal on Biden's speech yesterday. We got to talk about that.
Oh, okay.
There's, the Texas Roe abortion situation with the Supreme Court not acting. That's big, but, pundits don't really have a lot to say about it because it's too new. It just happened or just didn't happen, I guess you might say. We have the pandemic, of course. And then we have maneuvering in Congress on, what to do about infrastructure. So, we'll cover as much of it as we can. We'll try to cover all of that. But since you brought it up, let's talk about Nancy Letourneau's big picture look on New Orleans.
All right.
She has a blog about that from over the weekend.
Okay.
New Orleans levees. Who built that? Anyone who paid attention to what actually happened in 2005 during Katrina knows that the hurricane itself did enough damage, but the real toll came from the failure of the levees. In tracking the promises Obama made during his 2008 campaign, PolitiFact includes this one: will ensure that New Orleans has a levee and pumping system to protect the city against a 100-year storm by 2011, with the ultimate goal of protecting the entire city from a Category 5 storm. So what happened? The levees held.
Okay, that's good.
In New Orleans. They didn't held everywhere.
Oh.
And as people in Louisiana will tell you, there's more to Louisiana than just New Orleans. There's Baton Rouge and other places.
Which didn't promise
they got hit pretty hard.
Well, get someone to promise you something.
Yeah, I suppose. But, you got to start somewhere. And so putting the money in to strengthen the levees, I think, is important. The other side of that coin, of course, is you got to reassess whether you should be living where you're living. If you live in the Mississippi Delta floodplain, is that wise? Well, you can't move an entire city. But what about those small communities on barrier islands? Should they be rebuilt? I mean, that's something that they're really going to have to, come to grips with. Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, and maybe I am because, as you get older, everything all blends together, and I didn't look up the timeline. But do you remember a fellow named Bobby Jindal?
A volcano expert, as I recall.
Something like that. But he was also a berm expert.
Was he? Berms.
I mean, didn't he want to build berms
berm,
to protect New Orleans from hurricanes?
I don't know. You're right. It does get lost in don't monitor volcanoes, nuke hurricanes. He didn't say that part, but it does all mash up. Berms. Well, I mean, that's sort of like an earthen levee, right?
Right, something like that.
A berm. How did he mean? What did he want to do?
Let's
Berms
see.
in space?
Here's a piece from Mother Jones from June 24th, 2010. Bobby Jindal's berm warfare. Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal's at war with the federal government over his plans to build protective barrier islands or sand berms to shield the state's coast from BP's oil spill.
Oh.
He called a news conference yesterday to blast the government for standing in the way of his plan. We don't have time for red tape and bureaucracy.
Oh, no.
We're literally in a war to save our coast. But Jindal's attack critics say is pure political grandstanding from a politician who's been floated as a potential Republican presidential candidate. It just occurred to me, the other day that was Bobby Jindal's berm suggestion the earliest version of Ron DeSantis's Regeneron cure for COVID?
I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, it's a wild stance for him to take. I mean, first of all, a Republican saying we need to protect our coasts from oil spills. Like, I don't know what you thought. No wonder he's gone. That you could, of course, wouldn't fly now. Now they won't be telling
more
you,
the
drink
idea
the
that
oil.
I'm going to do
It's
something
good for you,
loud,
like ivermectin. Yeah.
Whether it has any benefit or not. That's not really the point. Maybe it does in some certain circumstance. You can't say it's completely crazy. I mean, barrier islands are good, and they'll help protect from hurricanes, not just oil spills.
Yes.
But,
but just artificially dumping sand
that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I'm running for president, and I want to be really loud about doing something that nobody else can say that they came up with first.
Yeah, well,
so I'm doing
you got me.
That's what struck me as, okay, well, that sounds like DeSantis.
You know what a berm is, of course, is just a wall. If you wanted to build a wall against the hurricanes. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's made of sand.
I mean, the idea was barrier islands. And so if you're going to build a sand berm, is he going to then build a community on it?
Well, hopefully not, but you never know. They did that in, like, Abu Dhabi, I guess.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, if you're going to live in a low-lying area, which is going to be prone to this, the difficulty there from the state's point of view, let alone the federal government, but from the state's point of view, is do you want to encourage that?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, you can build there, but just be advised you will no longer be able to get any kind of insurance.
Yes,
but it's up to you.
Sure.
You want to build there. I can't tell you. It's a free country, but maybe in some cases it's not a free country, and we say, you know what, we're just making the whole thing a state park, and you can't build there.
We're not going to make it free to rebuild anyway. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what those plans were. The berm thing.
Wiser heads than me. It just, it struck me as
maybe the berms would
a reminder that if you're going to have a barrier island community, which is swept away by a hurricane,
right?
Then should you be there?
It's a good question.
But we've always been there. You're breaking tradition.
Well, in some cases, yes. In other cases, of course, it's $1 million vacation rental homes that weren't there and shouldn't be there.
Well, those I don't feel so bad about.
Yeah, okay.
And whether you're talking about Louisiana barrier islands or the Florida Keys or other places that are built like that, it's what are you doing?
I don't know. But in the meantime,
it's a way of life.
Go on vacation there.
But it's your way of life, and maybe you should be totally responsible for it.
That's true. I guess you could ask, what did the ancients do when a hurricane wiped it out? They probably got in canoes and left, and then came back, and I mean they rebuilt.
They probably sacrificed some Democrats.
No government, maybe no government helped them do it.
Yeah, throw them in the volcano.
Right.
We just want to get back to traditional, things that we do.
Right.
So anyway, we're still assessing what's going on with the whole idea of what Ida has done. So not totally clear what all of that means. And then we can turn maybe to Biden's speech. I thought it was a terrific speech.
Okay.
I think it's a speech he's wanted to make for weeks, if not years. And he was prepared for it, and he delivered it well. And it was pretty clear what he was thinking.
He tells it so well.
And, of course, the jingoistic media, which really is pro-war. I mean, you just have to understand that it's pro-war. They're pro-intervention.
They're
pro, I want to send my troops there And I want to go with them. I want to be embedded.
Yes.
I want to get video for back home. It sells. Mm-hmm. So media is always into interventions. And, you could see some of them visibly upset, like Richard Engel, that it's ending.
Yes, apparently.
I mean, visibly upset. I can't believe that all of this is coming to an end. Well, it is. And it should. And, we stayed 19 years too long. And so the reactions to Biden's speech are predictable. Some of them are ridiculous. I mean, over the weekend, there was this ridiculous false charge that they left the service dogs behind. And the weirdest thing about it is that it was being promulgated by Donald Trump Jr., who's known to go overseas and shoot animals.
Oh, maybe that's what he was thinking.
So, no, it wasn't true, and it didn't really work. False videos about people being hung from helicopters. Actually, there was a helicopter picture of a guy hanging from a rope at the end of the helicopter, but what he was trying to do is hang a Taliban flag on a building. But that, morphed into, oh, look, they're hanging him now already. Just why? Why would you do that?
Helicopter?
Well, to stir up anti-Biden, sentiment and pro-war sentiment. That's the kind of crap that was floating around all weekend. And so when you see people with very legitimate concerns and criticism, and there are some, about how it all worked out, you just have to step back and say, well, what's your motivation? If 120,000 people were evacuated after the Americans were told since March or April by the embassy that you got to get out, and you stayed anyway.
Yeah.
And not 120,000 Americans, but, some thousands of Americans were evacuated. And some 200 are left behind, many of them with dual citizenship and complicated situations like I can't get my entire extended family, which in Afghanistan could be like lots of people. Then does that anecdote tell the whole story of the evacuation? Well, to TV reporters it does, because I know that guy. But and he'll talk to me. Mm-hmm. But does it really give you the whole entire picture? Dave Rothkopf has an interesting perspective, as he always does. From Afghanistan to infrastructure, the climate crisis to defending democracy, China policy to inequality, today America is having a major debate about its priorities going forward. In many ways, we have squandered the first decades of this century on a 20-year war. Thank you to George W. Bush and the Project for a New American Century and Paul Wolfowitz and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. But it's time to rethink that. President Biden has argued that rather than investing $3 trillion in wars, the vast majority of which goes to a handful of major U.S. defense contractors, and guess who's lobbying to stay there, we should invest it in the real source of our security and strength, people, infrastructure, R&D, health, education. He's argued that rather than focusing on wars that can't be won, we should prepare for the challenges of the coming century, great power rivalries, competitiveness, and addressing urgent needs like the climate crisis. He's emphasized that after neglecting infrastructure for half a century, not hardening our assets against next-generation threats, not preparing our students properly, not upgrading our healthcare systems, we must meet those challenges now or lose our ability to lead. And he's argued that it's high time to reverse 40 years of growing inequality, because in doing so, we not only can make the richest pay their fair share, but we can give everybody a chance to contribute. So the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan must be seen in this context. It's directly linked to reimagining our foreign policy so it's better suited for 21st century challenges. But it's also about an end to failed approaches and the folly of American exceptionalism. We should go there and we should create the country in our image because, we're great. I mean, that was really underlying the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's what PNAC was all about. Nobody knows what PNAC is anymore. But it was the idea that you should go in there and recreate the Middle East in our image because, that would be good.
Sure.
Forget about the fact that I don't understand the difference between Tajiks and Pashtuns and Uzbeks and what's going on in Afghanistan with tribal loyalties and extended family. I don't know anything about that. Right. Any more than I know about Sunnis and Shias. What difference does that make? Don't give me that stuff. Let's just go in there and,
I don't see
do
color
it right.
Anyway. Yeah, the I don't see color crowd didn't see any of the rest of this stuff either. And I have always argued that the C in PNAC is for century, and that's a soft C, and century should be pronounced correctly, and it's PNAS, not PNAC.
Yeah.
But there's no one buying this. I don't know.
Well, that's because there's already a well-respected journal called Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences. PNAS.
Oh, well, all right then. Yeah, that would be confusing.
So it would be confusing. So, like, if you're gonna, you can't do it.
Okay, we'll just we'll skip it then.
Right.
It wasn't working anyway.
Right. But
they should think about that.
Yeah. Yes, it's about being a better ally and not seeing the military as the solution to every problem, but it's also about shifting our focus to investing in ourselves, ending the foreign policy mistakes. Instead of spending trillions on the wars, he seeks to invest it in the real sources of our leadership and strength, and that's not isolationism. Biden and his team are offering not just decisions, but strategy, one in which foreign and domestic policies are two halves of a whole. If we recognize this, we can see the merits and the urgency that we embrace it. That's a pretty sensible approach to what Biden was talking about. The critics are there. Some people just can't give it up. They can't change. Max Boot says, I like Biden. I think he's a great president. I still think he shouldn't have withdrawn. And there's lots of neocons that just can't give up the idea that we leave. You just can't give it up. And I get that, but that doesn't mean it should, drive policy. Laura Seligman wrote on Twitter, covering the Pentagon for Politico. So she's a reporter. Biden says they reached out to Americans in Afghanistan 19 times since March to try to get them out. And that seems like not a lot given the circumstances.
Okay.
And Matt Iglesias said, how many times do you want? I don't get this.
Yeah. I don't know.
I mean, the message was clear, and it was clear since March.
Yeah. It's Afghanistan.
And yeah, but it wasn't enough because there were still people there. Well, maybe they didn't want to leave. And, I have the same reaction sometimes to the people on hurricane areas. Some can't leave.
Yeah.
And some won't leave.
Right.
That's not the same.
Some think they can ride it out. Some think
some want to ride it out.
I'm going to ride out Afghanistan.
Some won't go. Some can't go. Some have, relatives with dementia who won't leave the house, or simply can't afford to go anywhere else. Right. And there aren't any ways to get anywhere else, and there's no place to go. I mean, I get all of that. It's complicated. And so the idea that, we left people behind as a simplistic answer is just to score political points. It really doesn't solve anything. It doesn't explain anything. It's just not a good way of looking at it. Iglesias goes on to say, I'm still trying to imagine the reaction if Biden had done the thing people are pretending to believe he should have done and somehow forcibly evacuated people between the April Americans should leave the country notice and the fall of Kabul in August. Mm-hmm. Right? So you're going to go in there and you force people out?
Yes.
That's what you want?
Well, no, we want to criticize that.
No, we want to stay and so have this not happen in the first place. But that was not going to happen. It's like saying, I don't like the way you are handling COVID.
It is like that.
My solution is to not have COVID.
Yeah. I mean, you just declare yourself.
But, no.
I actually do think of it in a similar way where they just say, I declare us open. Well, the virus declares you closed. Well, the doors are still open. Everybody's too sick to enter them, but we're open, technically speaking. So, their solution was, we'll stay in Afghanistan and we're going to rule Bagram Air Force Base with an iron fist. The rest of the country, what are you going to do? I mean, and they're the Vietnam analogy again. There's certain areas that you claim to control, and then when it gets dark, you don't control it anymore. And they let you continue to pretend you control the place. And the Taliban, who live there, speak the language, and live among the people, laugh at you, let you have your little island on the Air Force Base. And it's very nice. You fly in contractors. They build Taco Bells for troops. And, we rule the rest of the country.
Yeah. Well, Rick to the Nazi in Casablanca. There's parts of New York City I would suggest you really shouldn't go.
Well.
I mean, you don't control everything, even if you think you do.
Right. And that used to be the Republican theory about that, from which they criticize either cities with Democratic mayors or overseas places, all the no-go zones. The rest of Afghanistan was a no-go zone, but Bagram Air Force Base has a fully functioning Taco Bell.
Right.
What an accomplishment.
So that's going to play out the way it plays out, but, some of the criticism is just plain suspect. And there is media criticism of that. I mean, one of the pundit roundup story that I have is an interesting piece, I think, from Ross Barkin, if I can locate it.
Hi, Ross. You're on the line. Go ahead.
Writing in Substack, the problem with media, groupthink, and economic precarity go together. When the news industry became populated by highly educated people who live in the affluent neighborhoods of two cities, the realities of America are shunted out. Groupthink dominates. The media world was always clubby, particularly in the big cities, and Robert Caro's power broker will remind you how shoddy mid-century reporters could be. But since the vanished world was bigger, dispersed among many towns and cities, the insularity could only matter so much. A reporter in San Diego was not commenting on the filtered sunset photo of a reporter in Brooklyn. Rituals naturally formed, and a consensus could be aggressively managed, but there was limitations to such endeavors in a world where there was really many more working reporters throughout America. 30,000 jobs are gone just since 2008. And in this new era, there's a poisonous brew of precarity and Twitter, where journalists meet daily to network, suck up, and joust with shared enemies.
Oh my.
Twitter doesn't matter like Facebook, but it can function at times like an assignment editor, with reporters and editors alike sifting through feeds for ideas. Twitter controversies become reported controversies. Meta-narratives evolve into hard narratives. Remember, the problem with journalism is the ongoing economic instability, not blue checks with melding opinions. Blue check is when you're verified by Twitter.
Right.
David and I are blue checks.
I'm not.
You're not?
No.
You should be. I'm a blue check. Who knows why? I asked them to. They said yes.
Well,
the two, though,
can
bleed into one another as reporters fret over offending colleagues or future editors by conveying wrongthink. And that has a lot to do with how Afghanistan is covered.
Well, I think so. And a lot of things.
And I got it in before the break. Do not try this at home. We are professionals.
Right. And if you do try it at home, send us the tape so that we can play it and take a nap. How about that? I encourage you to do so. All right. And me too. I'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. It's me, Gil. Minimal contributor to content, but regular contributor to funding for Kagro in the morning. Let's change things up from David's so very tired plea for your contributions with a plea of my own. If you want to add your voice to the show, do it. Record your own segment using your favorite recording device and send it to David. Read an article and give your opinion. Write your own essay and read that. The sky's the limit. Well, not really. Try to keep it relatively short so David doesn't have to stress about cutting it and hurting your feelings. Join the hallowed ranks of Greg Dworkin and Joan McCarter and be part of this somewhat witty deep dive into political topics with unnecessary censoring. Lend your voice to the show by sending it to kagrox@gmail.com. KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And let's continue on. Greg Dworkin's still with us. We were explaining why the media is the way it is. And we did it in about a minute or two, and thanks.
You know, it's just don't expect the media to cover this fairly. They're simply incapable. We knew this from 2003, and don't expect them to have learned any lessons, because they didn't learn any lessons from 2016 either.
Yes. I guess the good news now is you can chat about it loudly on Twitter, and some number
offend
of them
them, and then they get very defensive, and then they get messages from their corporate bosses. You're not supposed to be on Twitter.
Yeah, well, that's one way of doing it. And sometimes, occasionally, someone will say, look at all this chatter about this dissenting opinion on Twitter. I shall write about it. Sometimes that works.
Well, something along the lines of, you're not supposed to have opinions anyway.
Yeah.
So speaking of opinions, this is from the opinion section of the New York Times, where you are supposed to have opinions. This is Jamel Bowie writing. Do Republicans actually want the pandemic to end?
That's something
Joe Biden,
they
in his 2020 campaign for president, promised to get the coronavirus pandemic under control with additional aid to working families and free distribution of multiple effective vaccines. He would lead the U.S. out of its ongoing public health crisis. I think you can see where this is going. Rather than work with him to vaccinate the country, Biden's Republican opposition has, with only a few exceptions, like the Northeast, done everything in its power to politicize vaccination and make refusal to cooperate a test of partisan loyalty. The party is, for all practical purposes, pro-COVID. If it's sincere, it's monstrous, and if it's not, it's an unbelievably cynical and nihilistic strategy. Unfortunately for both Biden and the country, it appears to be working. Maybe. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we may actually be peaking at this point. And weirdly, and for unclear reasons, the virus may be moving in like 2-month cycles. There's an interesting piece from Dave Leonhardt in the New York Times today. As Delta peaked, we investigate COVID's mysterious 2-month cycles. Now, you can't tell by Florida because Florida's cooking its data. Not the way that fringy Florida health official Republican said when she was fired, and I'm not getting into that whole thing.
Oh, well, yeah,
but basically what they're doing is instead of like the rest of the states that report deaths when you hear about them, we got a report of 350 deaths, so the total's 350. They're saying, oh, we got a report of 350 deaths. One was from yesterday, so it's really 349. 49 were from last week, so it's really 300. And 100 of them were for last month, so it's really 200. And, another 100 was from the month before that, so today's total is 100.
Ah. Okay.
And although you're not looking at it now, if you look at the totals from a couple of months ago, if you look at it on a curve like everybody likes to do, you'll see a month ago and 2 months ago when we added that 100 and 200 cases, that went up.
Yes.
And so now we're down. Look how much down we are compared to 2 months ago.
Yes.
So we're doing great. It's dropping.
Oh, yeah.
And every other state is saying, oh, we just reported like 349 deaths. And last month we reported 20. So it's going up. Florida's saying, no, same data. It's going down. That's what I mean about cooking the books.
Yeah. Well, it is happening in a lot of states. And there was a lot of focus
on others
stopped
reporting altogether. But,
yes,
right. And they also stopped reporting county level stuff.
They did.
Because they were getting mad that Charles Gaba and others were saying, look, Republican counties are 3 times more likely to be infected and 1.5 more times likely to die, or whatever those numbers are. I don't have them right in front of me. But he was clearly showing that there is a partisan relationship to how people are doing, and they didn't like that. So now they prevented county level data from being collected and reported, which of course means CDC doesn't have it because CDC depends upon the state to do these things. Yeah,
and they just think that, if the numbers
if we give
are
it to
zero,
CDC, they'll just release it and make us look bad, so we won't give it to them. And then you wonder why CDC doesn't have a handle on all the data.
That's true, too. It's another outcome that I don't know. I mean, they didn't care. They didn't care about the CDC having data. But it is interesting, all during the Trump phase of the pandemic, by which I mean the pandemic, the whole thing, basically. But during the time while he was in office, Republicans ran around saying, Democrats don't want the pandemic to end. They want to keep our businesses closed and our schools closed and keep paying people to do nothing, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, once he lost the election and then lost the coup and Biden was inaugurated, it became that suddenly they didn't want the pandemic to end. But no one is out there until now saying, hey, maybe Republicans don't want the pandemic to end. The difference, of course, was, if you could even make the case that Democrats, quote, didn't want the pandemic to end. They didn't want the mitigation efforts to end prematurely so that people wouldn't continue to get sick and die. Whereas Republicans say, I think now if more people get sick and die, they'll blame the Biden administration, so let's do it. And they're sort of from different planets, those two strategies.
Here's Brian Beutler writing in Crooked, Republican vaccine denial is a political strategy.
Yeah.
New York Magazine's Jonathan Chait has taken issue with me and a few other liberals who argue that certain conservative and Republican elites have intentionally subverted recovery from the pandemic to undermine Biden. He argues instead the right's general bent on the virus has not fundamentally changed. I saw that argument on Twitter. It was kind of interesting. The former assertion rests on a huge historical coincidence that makes it difficult to falsify, namely that the government only authorized coronavirus vaccines in the immediate aftermath of the election after it becomes clear that Donald Trump would no longer be president. The latter assertion is only true if you ignore copious evidence of sabotage. Now, normally I'd let my short-form responses, which is to say Twitter, stand on their own, but there's more at stake in this disagreement than scorekeeping between columnists. If liberals don't understand the contours of the right-wing elite's value system, they'll be unable to anticipate conservative efforts to engineer democratic governing failures. and their efforts to govern successfully despite the opposition will fail. Chait's argument rests in the very real continuity between Republican hostility to pandemic mitigation under Trump and Biden. If Republicans had a partisan motive then, it was the belief that opening up the economy and taking the hit to public health would help Trump. It seems hard to understand how they would suddenly decide the same course of action would hurt Biden. And this reasoning elides three key points, which taken together make it perfectly easy to understand. Okay? First, and most obviously, GOP hostility to COVID-19 mitigation likely cost them the election. That is, their calculation that encouraging spread to avoid economically harmful mitigation measures would redound to the president's political benefit, and it was wrong. Now, it may not have been wrong in Texas. It may have won Texas. I've made that point a lot, that, people with low-income jobs need the money. And so it may have helped make, for example, Latino and Latino voters vote surprisingly for Republicans. Secondly,
more than they were
Republicans didn't have a position on vaccine promotion before this winter because the vaccines were still undergoing clinical trials. So that was off the table. Right? You couldn't say, well, this is our position on vaccines, and it changed. We didn't have the vaccines. You were promoting the fact that you were making vaccines and you thought they were great, but you didn't really have a specific position. You didn't become part of the anti-vax community.
I guess.
Yes. Yeah. And then finally, the main difference between Trump and Biden on this score upends the Republican calculus under Trump because Biden takes the pandemic seriously and promised to crush the virus. To ascertain whether conservative leaders have encouraged spread to damage Biden's presidency, you need to begin by asking whether the rhetorical and substantive bent on the vaccines would be different than it is if Trump had won. It's in the nature of counterfactual analysis that nobody can answer the question, but I think it's strange credulity to imagine that so many prominent conservatives would have embraced anti-vaccine politics if Trump had won, and if, I would add, Trump was pushing it.
Right.
Can you imagine DeSantis and Noem and Abbott refusing to vaccinate if Trump said, no, you have to?
No, that's not.
It's ridiculous. I mean, it's just that's where the counterfactual is. Now, in Jonathan Chait's favor, there are specific individual Republicans who have pushed vaccines and have always pushed vaccines, some of them surprisingly so. Okay, Mitch McConnell comes to mind.
Yes.
He's done PSAs. He's been very clear that Kentucky should be vaccinated. And that's been true forever, and that hasn't changed at all, right? But the individual story doesn't tell the whole picture any more than if you're going to look at the Afghanistan withdrawal, as some of my conservative friends were doing this morning on Twitter with me, and say it was a failure because look at the story of this one person who didn't get out that I read on Twitter that I don't really know.
Okay.
Because you don't know how complicated it is and whether or not he was a dual citizen and wanted his entire family and his extended family, and you don't know whether he got the order in March or April and then didn't listen. You don't know. You don't know any of that. All you know is he couldn't get out and now he's upset. And therefore that proves my point that Biden screwed up.
I see.
No. I mean, it's bad. Well, you don't have any empathy. Well, yeah, I do. I have terrible empathy. It's a terrible situation. It's awful. It was created by us not getting out 19 years ago and leaving, except for the one time we should have stayed, which was Tora Bora, because we went there to kill bin Laden. So one thing has nothing to do with the other. I'm sure it's a very upsetting story, even if it's true, which we don't know, because we know a lot of BS is flying around that isn't true. And just because you read it on Twitter or see it on the news doesn't make it true, and it doesn't mean that guy wasn't a friend of the reporter. I don't know. But what I do know is 120,000 people did get out, and they were warned to get out way before then, and it's messy, and it's tragic, and it's terrible, and I am certain we've left people behind. I feel bad for them. We still had to get out.
Yeah. I mean, okay. That seems like a fair explanation of what we could be saying about that.
So because Phil Scott has overseen a successful vaccine rollout. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has been adamantly pro-vaccine. He picks up on McConnell also. And if he could be louder and more critical of the anti-vax members, that'd be okay. But, that's all right. But because his ego is wrapped up in the apparent success of Operation Warp Speed, Trump himself speaks up in favor of getting vaccinated. He even gets booed at his rallies when he say that.
Yeah.
Though he wields the vaccine rejection that his allies have fomented as a cudgel against Biden, he's not doing well. He's way behind schedule, and people are refusing to take the vaccine because they don't trust him. That's his line.
Yes.
I mean, as a con man, Trump is pretty good on picking up whatever works. He tries 19 different things and sees what the audience reacts to, and then that's what he goes with.
I mean, even at the cost of being booed along the way. He doesn't
But
care.
that's why those rallies are so important to him. Those are his focus groups, and he uses them to hone his message. But the novel and highly contagious nature of this virus makes it such that the pro-COVID right doesn't need unanimity to sabotage the pandemic. They just need a couple of cynical governors, influential media figures to mutually reinforce a combination of bad policies and dishonest messaging. When it became clear that Trump would no longer be president, Ron Johnson invited an anti-vaxxer to testify before the Senate Homeland Security Committee. That was at the time that they still ran the place, which he then shared and might share today, still had Republicans not gone to lose this Georgia Senate. Would he have gone full anti-vax if Trump had been reelected and was promoting the vaccines? Would Republican governors be discouraging vaccine uptake? Would Fox News primetime be nightly anti-vax infomercial?
No.
I think the answer to all these questions is no. And if it's no, then they're spreading COVID to harm the incumbent.
Okay, then.
He makes some more points along those lines, but that's the point that he's trying to make. So this is from Vanity Fair. Texas governor asked for COVID help after royally effing up pandemic response. Don't worry, though. He's still banning mask mandates and other measures that could actually stop the virus.
Right. Thank you.
Right? Everybody knows Ron DeSantis, but Greg Abbott is pretty terrible.
He is, and there are many others, too. They just, I guess are running lower or further behind in the presidential sweepstakes, but a lot of Republican governors doing the same things and not getting noticed because Florida and Texas are huge and their numbers are huge. But, Tennessee, per capita numbers will tell you the story, too. Yeah, Tennessee and a few other hot
Missouri
spots.
before them.
Mm-hmm, right. And,
the hospitals don't have enough ICU beds. They're pitching tents and shipping people out of state. But ask people who wear masks, what are you, nuts? In related news, Texas does not appear to be scrapping its insane new guidance for schools, which says that schools need not conduct contact tracing. Schools do not need to let parents know if a student's tested positive. Parents can still send their kids to school even if they come in contact with an infected person. But on the bright side, Abbott's made time to catch up in extracurricular activities like play the fiddle.
Oh, well, I'm glad he's had time for that. I did see this morning where an 11th East Texas school district has shut down classes due to COVID outbreaks. Once again, can't really disagree with the virus. You say you're open, although they're admitting they're closed at least. That's a step in the right direction. That's just East Texas. And
right. So
I don't know when they started.
Let's look at what Dominique Henke is an epidemiologist and tried to talk a little bit about back in March of 2021.
This March. Okay, yes.
Okay. That's 5 months ago.
All right.
How the school season in the fall was going to play out.
Oh.
And it's kind of interesting. She said she made a few mistakes in this, but, she went back and said, for the most part, it helps explain things. As adults are vaccinated, they'll be less likely to be infected. Now, we know with Delta, that's not necessarily as firm as we would like, but it's still true.
Okay.
And as we talked about the other day on the show, it's part of the impetus to get a booster.
Right.
The booster helps protect you against infection, whereas the first two in the series protect you against disease.
Okay.
And people want to be protected against infected. So Civic's poll this morning says people really like the idea that they're getting boosters. Even if, there's risks about reducing the number of first shots for everybody else, they still think, like in the 70% range or more, that it's a good idea that Americans get boosters. So as adults are vaccinated, they'll be less likely to be infected, even if exposed to COVID. And as more adults become immune, the population who's still susceptible is going to be kids.
Yes.
Said this back in March.
Well,
so, for example, if only 10% of infections are in the 5 to 14 range, as adults become vaccinated, the group's going to make up an increasing proportion of cases. And that's true even if their infection rate was constant, because there'd be less infected adults. So kids don't get COVID that much. Well, if no adults are getting it, then the only ones who are getting it are kids.
Yes.
That's just the way it works. Right. That's just science. So as more schools go in person, kids will have more contact with each other, both in classrooms and in sports, play dates, etc. So the infection rate's also likely to increase. And again, even if the chance of each interaction doesn't change, and it did with COVID, because Delta. When you have more contacts, the probability of one of them being infected goes up. That's the whole idea of minimizing contact. Well, what are we supposed to do? Wear a mask and stay away from each other forever? Well, just do unnecessary stuff. Even that's a help. So more contact between kids means more infections with kids, particularly if the virus hasn't been controlled before the increase in contacts occurs. And with Delta, that's exactly what happened.
Right.
Now, it's possible that you could also lower the chance of passing COVID during these interactions with good masks, high adherence, good ventilation, outdoor interactions. And every school should have been using all of that time to increase their ventilatory capacity indoors because it's a airborne infection. You could do box fans. They're not that expensive with a filter. Distancing, high asymptomatic testing, etc., and that would help lower transmission. And this will occur in some places, but there's a lot of places that cannot or will not have good mitigation, so transmission might go up much more there. Hello, welcome to the South. Mm-hmm. That's not why they call it Delta, but as transmission goes up, it snowballs, making it more likely you encounter somebody infected and spirals upwards. So there's the general infectious disease dynamics part of this, and then there's the human behavior part. As adults become less vulnerable, they're going to lower their guard for themselves and probably their kids. That means, I'm going to bars again.
Apparently, it does mean that. I don't know why.
And mitigation efforts will fail, and this will be combined with loosening restrictions on businesses and activities. So infected kids, often asymptomatic, are more likely to be indoors together or with unvaccinated adults, so transmission continues. And while overall infection rates are likely to drop, the burden of infection is likely to shift towards kids. And we've talked about it on the show. You could see that even though the kids get infected less than the adults, the spike is in the kids, and the capacity to take care of sick kids is much less in adults, so it's a lot less flexible. It's a lot less elastic because you can't just make kid beds. It doesn't work that way. How dangerous this is depends in part on what variants are circulating, she said in March, and how vulnerable the children are who become infected during this time. As infections become more widespread, we're more likely to see severe disease in kids who seem low risk just because the more kids who are infected, the more likely hidden vulnerabilities will come to the surface, similar to how some dangers of new meds get revealed once approved, because I would add, thousands of people take them. Mm-hmm. On the other side of that coin is millions of people have gotten the vaccine, so we have a pretty good handle on vaccine safety. And if the new variants prove to be more risky for kids or even some portion of kids, it could be more dangerous. Side note, the more the virus passes between people, the more mutations happen, the more variants show up, and some could be really nasty. She said this back in March, and it's pretty much spot on.
Okay.
And so if you're wondering why the focus is on kids right now and why we're having issues in school, just step back and think, we haven't gotten all of the adults vaccinated we want to. We are sending them to school because we feel like we have to.
We do
but
feel that way.
Mask mitigation makes sense because it's part of the Swiss cheese idea of prevention. One slice of cheese, you can get through the holes, but several slices of cheese at different angles tends to block all the holes. So every little thing you do helps. If you don't have to have a big party exposure, plus you wear a mask, it's not the party exposure, it's not the mask, it's together. You've decreased the risk a little bit. Pushing as quickly as possible to get the under 12 vaccinated and making sure that 12 to 18-year-olds, in fact, are vaccinated will help your school system tremendously, and the teachers and everybody who's there, all the adults who are in schools. So pushing for those things is important. Increasing ventilation in the schools with the cheapest, simplest methods, but understanding that it's important to making that a priority, not wiping the goddamn books down.
Yes.
Not deep cleaning the school. Don't waste money on that.
Oh, they're doing
Buy 100 box fans and put one in each classroom for the same amount of money it costs you to deep clean the schools, which is useless.
Yes, and I'm very discouraged to see that that's what a lot of the schools that are being forced to close down are doing. They're saying, well, we're going to close for X number of days and have a deep cleaning like that.
No, we're going to close down for a couple of days, and we're going to put box fans in every room with a filter.
Yeah.
Or HEPA filters if we could afford it.
Right, if you can. And it's not clear that they... By the way, this will probably end up falling to teachers, just like most classroom materials. Like, if you want a box fan,
It costs $50 or $75, or whatever it costs, and here's the instructions. You can make it yourself. If you could tape up a box, you could make a box fan. I'll give you the directions, and then you have to do it in addition to buying school supplies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's basically what's happening. I got to ask the kids whether there's anybody with, these fans, which are makeshift air purifiers, or whether anybody has bought, by the way, air purifiers and put them in their classrooms. Just curious to see what's out there, because they can't. I know you were saying they should have been using the time to talk about increasing ventilation, but a lot of these schools are built, to prevent that from happening. Can't open the windows.
Right. So there's still things you can do with filters indoors.
Right. Yes.
Because making it so you can open the windows and getting better ventilation in the schools is really expensive.
It is.
But box fans are cheap.
That's
filters
true.
Are cheap.
Although I'm finding that some of the schools are running into the problem of we panicked early and we spent all our money on deep cleaning and ionization products for our HVAC system.
And we fell for scams.
Yeah. And the money that we could have spent on box fans with filters strapped to the sides or taped to the sides, depending on your construction methods, went to, we put some sort of electronic thing in our duct system for $6,000 to $10,000, and I was told that it was going to eliminate COVID. And now I'm out of money. That's bad.
Anyway, finally, and I think we should cover it, and I didn't leave it for last because it's the least important, but it's just that it's so new that we don't have everything written we want to. This is Erin Biba on the Texas decision and the Supreme Court decision not to challenge it. I know this is trite and repetitive because so many have said it before, but I just cannot stop thinking about all the men who were so sure this would never happen, who shrugged off all the women who tried to sound alarms, who treated us like we were hysterical overreactors. I also can't stop thinking about the fact that they'll keep doing this. They'll shrug off the pain and suffering of pregnant people in the South because they don't care about marginalized people in red states. They'll say it's not happening to anybody that matters. And I can't stop thinking about how they'll keep calling us hysterical overreactors when we say this is just the beginning. The floodgates are opening, and they won't stop until they've destroyed the civil rights of everybody who has a uterus. They'll take so much more from us. They'll take every right from us as they possibly can, and we'll just be told at every single stop along the way. They'll never be able to take the next thing and then the next thing. And when there's nothing left, they'll say they never saw it coming.
This is all true. I didn't mean to make it like, some women do it. But I mean, I'm just saying, Susan Collins said, it's all going to be fine.
That's the first thing I said when I heard it.
Yeah,
Susan
but she's...
That was my tweet, Susan
Collins.
Collins.
What she has is right, and then throw Susan Collins in at the end. Okay.
Yep. New York Times says Supreme Court did not take action on a request to block a Texas law prohibiting most abortions after about 6 weeks of pregnancy, allowing the most restrictive abortion law in the U.S. to go in effect. Maya Sen points out 6 weeks is nearly always before women know they're pregnant. Right. So this is the end of abortion in Texas. Quietly overnight on procedural grounds, be furious.
Yes, and then there's also that weird aspect of it that they threw in, which I think normally I would have thought would have doomed the thing, was that Texas throws in a provision that says if anybody gets an abortion, contra to our new restrictions, if you report them and the doctor, you can sue them directly for damages. You get a private right of action against doctors, and I think the women who sought the abortions as well. I don't know, but you get to sue them and you get to keep the money. So there's
law of unintended consequences. Given the fact that wealthy people, wealthy white people and their mistresses will get their abortions, maybe they'll fly them to New York to get them.
Right. Or some.
Can you sue the airlines and Uber?
Sure. Why
and everybody involved?
Right. My current concern is, can I sue Greg Abbott if a pregnant woman dies of COVID? Is my next step. But apparently the answer will be no to that. No.
But according to his own law, can't you sue everybody who's helping the rich evade the law? Can you sue everybody involved?
Well, which rich person? My kind of rich person? No, you can't sue them.
Well,
liberal Hollywood elites, yes.
This is like prohibition. The idea that people won't get abortions because of this law is ridiculous. So since they will, what do you do about
it? Run around and yell, and then run for president. And see if they catch you with a weird, ranch with an offensive name. or something along those lines. I don't know. They just do what they want. Gimmitarianism prevails once again. My people get to do what they want. Your people
exactly
don't.
Right. That's exactly my point here. So, but the last point I'll make before the end of the show, and again, I'm not doing this topic last because it's least important, just because there's the least written about it. One thing has been written about it. Bill Schur writes, if Roe v. Wade is struck down, it'll cost Republicans. The Supreme Court could overturn the landmark abortion ruling. Democrats could benefit, especially in purple swing states. So I don't expect people to take this lying down. And it does have ramifications for the 2022 election. And just a reminder that all the pundits who like to say Republicans are going to win because nothing changes and everything is written in stone, and wrote that before Afghanistan and in the middle of the pandemic that we don't know how it's going to evolve. And this maybe ought to rethink their priors.
I think so. But yeah, it might cost them the election. And one of the things, though, that we ought to be, prepared to push Democrats to do. I mean, lots of people doing it now already and have found themselves frustrated and disappointed. But you can, of course, win back Congress and retain the White House and say, we're going to set this right. But until, as long as the Supreme Court is sitting there 6-3 willing to strike down long-standing precedent, they'll just stand there and strike down everything that you pass out of Congress as well. You're going to need to be prepared with a reaction to that. How will you deal with it? Court expansion seems to be the leading candidate for corrections on that front, and still no interest among mainstream power-wielding Democrats, apparently. So that's bad news.
Yep.
All right. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour, or at least to the music that brings us to the top of the hour. Thanks, Greg.
I did my best to sum up a whole bunch of different things, which aren't necessarily related, but they sort of are, because this is a Republican governance, and be aware of it, and you better get mad.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a good message. It'll carry us to, as far as tomorrow, when you'll be back. So that's
or
good news.
Maybe even till like 2 minutes after the break.
That can happen too. We'll find out after. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, unless you were here the whole time, which is a possibility. I checked into it. Word is that live listeners were treated to the hour background noise and background discussion during the first break, which I thought might mean, well, yesterday I reran an old rerun that didn't have the breaks built into them the way we build things in for the last, I don't know, how long have we been doing it? 2 years, 3 years, something like that. Though we did have breaks, and if you were a long-time listener, they might have been real throwbacks. If you are not all that long time a listener, you might have heard them for the first time. But we used to have a couple of, we grabbed some PSAs that were sort of like free things to use if we needed a break for one reason or another, and we'd throw them in at random times. And of course we used to have the I guess you could call them fake commercials, but they were, they sounded like real commercials, but they were aimed at, the same thing. But Crashing Vor, who used to do not only commercials, anti-Romney commercials back in the day, and songs and all sorts of things that we used for breaks. And now, of course, we have a more formal break system. And anyway, Justice programs in at the right times when our stream of our discussion will stop on the Netroots radio feed. And Greg and I continue to talk during the breaks, and sometimes when Joan is here, we're talking during the breaks. But instead, there's a superseding signal that goes out over the feed of breaks that Justice engineers. And when I'm playing an old piece or an old rerun or something that I threw together for an absence, and I don't build the breaks in, I warn them, oh, by the way, you want to basically turn the brakes off, the automatic brakes off, and let the tape run straight through what would normally be our break times. And, it's an easy thing to do. He's got it all rigged up. And then once or twice we've come back from that, especially when we've done extended absences. And we find, oh, yeah, right, we forgot to turn the brakes back on, B-R-E-A-K-S, brakes, back on. And, so nothing superseded your feed during your break time, and so your conversation goes out. So that's an easy mistake to make. But as it turns out, no, Justice said, I remember, I turned off the breaks yesterday, I turned them back on for this morning, and now I'm not sure why that first break didn't run, because the second and third breaks are programmed in there, and the first one was too, it just didn't go. So I guess we'll find out whether or not the second one went. And if that's the case, then we'll talk about how we don't know why that's happening. But then we'll be more conscious, I suppose, of what we say during the breaks. And maybe we'll come up with something really special and fun to make you want to listen during the breaks. And I assume you want the show to continue on. We just need a break. I guess why did we originally do that? I think we originally programmed them so rigidly because there was a time during which a couple of regular radio stations, terrestrial radio as they call it now in the satellite radio age, who were simulcasting our show, and they, being regular radio stations, needed breaks at they suggested the top of the hour and the bottom of the hour, that there be breaks that they could use for station identification, something we absolutely ignore entirely on ours, because we don't operate as a station, and that is to say the FCC doesn't control a license for us or anything like that, so we don't have to do that. Isn't that odd? Back in the day, I guess, that was very important to people who were regulating radio. You must, every half hour, tell people what radio station they're listening to. And it became something like of a promotional thing. It made sense for the radio station to tell everybody what you were listening to so that people would know, and they would become familiar with it and say, I like station WTF or whatever it is that you were listening to. But we don't have to do that, although, when we come back from breaks, we still say it. It's a tradition in radio to say here on Netroots Radio, even though it doesn't matter in the least. That is just straight up self-promotion. Okay. Well, the mighty OCD heard it and said it was funny hearing you guys talk smack about the juice box mafia. And I don't even know that there was any smack. It was like, well, back in the day, although then we accused them of living the high life in gated communities now, which they don't. But they do make considerably more money. But you remember the juice box? That wasn't my idea to call them that, juice box mafia. Somebody else came up with that one. And they embraced it. But back in the day when, if I have the people correctly, like people like Ezra Klein and Brian Beutler and who else lived in this? But there were, I don't think Matt Iglesias lived there, did he? I don't know. Anyway, all of the same generation, essentially. And they, as just starting in journalism, the point was that they were able, due to their socioeconomic status in the start of life, able to, take on low-paying internships in the media so that they could gain the experience necessary that was the thinking at the time, gain the experience necessary at the time to launch into media, as a full-time paid professional reporter. And that's kind of the way it worked back in the day. And then it was pointed out, there's lots of people who want to break into journalism who can't afford to live on either with an unpaid internship or with a minimal stipend. And it's a privilege to be able to do so, and it is. And I think most of the people who are members of what became the juice box mafia, because they were young, all right, at the time, and I guess young people drink juice boxes. Juice is good for you. You should keep drinking it. But they recognize, I think, the privilege that allowed them to be able to afford to survive that way for some number of years, a low number of years, in order to break out into real journalism as paid journalists, and some of them particularly well paid, and others still, doing okay, but they're not millionaires by any stretch. But now they're Twitter famous people, or legitimately famous people with big time columns and whatnot. Anyway, they're nice guys. And for the most part, I guess, I don't know, maybe one of them is a jerk and I'm forgetting him. But I think they're basically nice guys and doing good work, and we cite them all the time because we think they're right. So, kudos to them for doing it, and I think changing the way things get reported these days for the most part, and they've been a positive influence, but they like juice. Nothing I can do about that. It's not my fault. And somebody else came up with that name, but it was a great one, and I think it was so funny that they decided they should just embrace it. No one says it anymore. It's an old and archaic term, and only a few of us are around to remember it these days. All right, back to other subjects at hand. I don't know what the hell I put aside for all of this. There were many. There were definitely a couple of things that I wanted to get to that were small-ish stories. I happened to see, maybe we'll have to trace the provenance of this one back, but I saw Ira Goldman, who tweets as KD by proxy, and who is himself something of a congressional procedure buff. I think a long time, was he a Senate side staffer? I think so. No. Both, I guess. Look, I'm just looking at his Twitter bio here. He used to be a Hill staffer, obviously. He says, I used to write laws. Then I invented Knee Defender. Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. It's just by happenstance. The guy who came up with it was a device that you could put on. I don't know. Did you wear it on your lap, or did you put it on the seat in front of you when you're on an airplane and you're in, where normal people sit in the economy section there, and people would lean back, and the seats are designed to do that or whatever. But if you could get your knees smashed, was the idea, when people leaned back really quick. And so he had the Knee Defender, which was a device that I guess not only protected your knees, but that was the main idea, was you were supposed to say, it's all about protecting my knees, not about the other part of the function of the device, which was true, preventing the person in front of you from leaning all the way back. I think it was a little questionable what you were entitled to. But at any rate, I don't know, did that make him able to retire? Is that what happened? Really? Did he make all that money on Knee Defender? It's like the jump to conclusions, Matt. Really? Should you have been able to retire based on that? Anyway, I used to write laws, then I invented Knee Defender, XHPSCI. That's the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. The Intelligence Committee, as normal people call it. Also, ex-Senate Trade, Tech, Telecom, Taxes, and Antitrust, Crime, and even reputed parliamentarian, as he says. What the hell do we care about that? The answer is he is discussing something esoteric, as usual, but something that Armando has discussed a lot. The need for reform, or just simply declaring unconstitutional, the Electoral Count Act. And let's see, I'll have to look at the thread in which that he's referring to, but he's responding to a Greg Sargent piece and the tweet promoting that piece. I don't know how we're going to get to this exactly. Oh, and by the way, there goes one of the Juicebox Mafia members via Twitter just now, Dave Weigel, who I think was similarly part of the group. Okay. So Greg Sargent, who did not live in that house, I don't believe, but writes from the same perspective as many of their members, says a coalition of election experts is issuing an urgent call for reform of the Electoral Count Act. This, he says, is a critical way to safeguard against future stolen elections and even against another January 6th. That is possible. Their blueprint is detailed and important, and his latest column is attached, and we should read that, and then we can go back and read the Ira Goldman observations on it, and a couple of other Ira Goldman observations in the last couple of days that I wanted to add to the pile here. But yeah, could it safeguard against a future stolen election or against another January 6th? Yes and no. here we suffer from the same problem of like, well, okay, we can legislate against this, but if it's a coup and they don't care what the law is, then there's not that much you can do to prevent it. But you do try, like, you set up rule of law and hope that, somebody balks when they're called upon by the Republican Party to stage a coup. It happens, right? We saw Liz Cheney do it. Not that she's changed her mind and become a Democrat or anything of the sort, but she would balk at the right time. Or, for that matter, who are we talking about? Raffensperger, is that the name? Down in Georgia, whereas Secretary of State, he's still Republican and still would generally want Trump to win, just not this way. Just balked at what he was being asked to do on behalf of the Trump campaign, by Trump, I guess we should just say, by Trump directly, to just make up the numbers, find the votes. Let's take a look at what Greg Sargent had to say back in the olden days of August of 2021, because it's September now. This was August 30th, a long, long time ago. Galaxy, 40-minute drive in warp speed. So not far, far away, but not close, just far enough that you don't want to get in the Millennium Falcon and go there for an extra quart of milk, if you know what I mean. So, how to prevent the next January 6th, as revealed in an important new analysis. And this is just an opinion by Greg Sargent. We cannot say we weren't warned, that's true. As the Select Committee examining the January 6th violence ramps up, one of its lesser-known goals is to offer, quote, recommendations, whatever that might mean, to prevent a future effort to overthrow U.S. democracy through mob assault and intimidation. Like, I recommend, I have a recommendation. Arrest and hang them all. That's a recommendation. It's not a strong recommendation, but it feels good momentarily. I would examine it a little bit before we implement it. I think we'll probably talk ourselves out of it, but that's one recommendation, how to prevent future efforts. And it might not be a bad idea to hang a few of them, just as an example. I don't know. That's a very traditional approach to these things. And as you know, I'm nothing if not a traditionalist. And maybe nothing. Anyway, as it happens, there is a critical way Congress can minimize the possibility of another January 6th by addressing glaring legal vulnerabilities in the presidential electoral process that encouraged Donald Trump's movement to try to overturn his loss, creating the conditions for the worst outbreak of U.S. political violence in recent times. Again, I think it's obvious to everybody that, sometimes it won't work to thwart them, to say, what you're doing is illegal, or even strongly illegal. It just doesn't. But, okay, you got to try, right? If you're a believer in the rule of law and not, at first blush, a believer in let's hang them, say, you're going to want to try. Now, you might have to hang people because, that's what the law says, and they disobeyed it, and they keep doing this, and we're really not going to be rid of this until everybody is afraid to do this again. It used to be in this country back in the olden days when times were good and we wanted to make America first, or want to make America great again. Well, it's an old Trump argument, right? The police used to be very rough on these guys, and hanging them is extremely rough. Anyway, where were we? We're talking about revising the Electoral Count Act of 1887. That may sound dry and unexciting, but it would shore up hidden weaknesses that made the 2020 breakdown possible. This week, a bipartisan coalition of pro-democracy experts will release a new blueprint laying out a way to revise the ECA along those lines. The report from the National Task Force on Election Crises, which includes dozens of experts in election law and voting rights, outlines major fixes. By way of example, how a future election might be stolen is this next section. The ECA's language, which sets the process for Congress to count presidential electoral votes, is vague and prone to abuse. The ECA sets a safe harbor deadline. We've heard about that a number of times. If a state certifies its electors 6 days before the Electoral College meets, Congress must count them, but it can technically throw out a particular electoral vote if it decides it was not, quote, regularly given. This phrase is supposed to indicate serious corruption or illegality, but isn't defined, leaving it open to bad faith congressional objections to those electors. The ECA is supposed to provide for resolution of resulting disputes in Congress over any state's slate of electors. If a single senator and House member, a single one from each is all it takes, objects to a slate, each chamber must vote on them. If both chambers agree to invalidate the slate, they don't get counted. There are several main ways this can result in stolen elections. One is if a state sends one slate of electors, a valid one, reflecting the state's popular vote, and both chambers, nonetheless, I would add, decline to count them based on a bogus claim that they were not, quote, regularly given. Imagine a GOP-controlled Senate and House, both voting against counting the Democratic candidates' valid electors from, say, Pennsylvania, based on the false claim that the election's outcome was uncertain. In a close election decided by that state, the GOP candidate could prevail with a majority of electoral votes. A second stolen election scenario involves a state sending two competing slates of electors, one valid and the other based on bogus fraud claims in defiance of the popular vote. A GOP-controlled Congress could simply count the wrong one. And then in parentheses he adds, here's a complication. The ECA stipulates that the slate certified by the governor is the one that must be counted. So in some permutations, the right one could end up getting counted, but in others, the wrong one could. In other words, it might be that you remember the scenario from, this year, and this past election, where they were prevailing upon Republican legislatures to simply adopt a new slate and send that one instead, and that would do the trick, that Congress would then, I don't know why they thought that this Congress would do this, but that Congress would then adopt the slate of electors sent by the state legislature rather than the one that had been signed by the governor. But, they felt that would really work. And then I guess it could be exploited the other way. If they had instead prevailed on governors to sign a fake slate of electors, they could have pointed to the law and said, Congress is supposed to accept the one signed by the governor. And that's this one, this wrong one. In a third scenario, a GOP state legislature could send a rogue slate of electors, and a GOP-controlled House might count them while a Democratic Senate refused to. Because the ECA requires both chambers to invalidate a slate for it to be cast out, it might end up counting. In all these scenarios, the court could intervene, but we'd be in crisis territory at best. Now, the Electoral Count Act does not provide clear answers in all scenarios. Genevieve Nadeau, I'm guessing it's that pronouncing Nadeau, I don't know, Nadeau, counsel with Protect Democracy told me, it says me, but it's Greg Sargent, because he's me in this case, it is susceptible to misunderstanding or worse, like President Trump believing that Vice President Pence had the power to simply do all this himself and simply say, I will select this slate from among the competing ones and just say this is the one we're voting on. That's pretty bad misunderstanding. Trump pressured GOP state legislatures to set scenarios like these in motion, and many GOP members of Congress objected to correct slates on bogus grounds. Meanwhile, quote, audits, you know about them, in Arizona and elsewhere are dry runs at manufacturing pretexts to raise sufficient doubt about a state's popular vote to trigger such scenarios. So we've been warned. In a closer election, under the right circumstances, such an effort could succeed. Now, next section, time for reform. The report recommends numerous ECA reforms, among them dramatically raise the threshold for objections to electors in Congress, well above one member from each chamber. Reform could also codify what grounds must be met for objections to be heard by the full Congress. Again, you run into the issue of the Congress simply saying, to hell with that, we don't care what the law says the grounds have to be. We set the rules of our own procedure here. That's a constitutional prerogative, and we simply vote to overrule the chair's interpretation or the parliamentarian's interpretation of what the law requires here. But you try to put that barrier in place to illustrate just how brazen the coup attempt is, at the very least. Clarify, next bullet point, clarify how congressional disputes over electors are resolved. The statute needs to explain precisely what happens in Congress in every such scenario. Again, they could choose to ignore it, but I will argue, if the law said, if the ECA at some point had said, by the way, it is also the case that at no point and in no way does the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, have the power to make this decision unilaterally. It absolutely has to be decided some other way, whether that's by a vote of the House, vote of the Senate, vote of both. It can't be done just by the vice president. If it was clear and in black and white and said that, it would be ordinarily superfluous. And by the way, the ordinary conservative interpretation of the absence of any such addressing of the powers of the vice president would serve usually in the conservative mind as a prohibition against its exercise. If it's not explicitly authorized by the law, then no, the vice president can't simply do this by himself. But they threw all that out because gametarianism. So I guess the theory is if the law said in black and white the vice president can't do this, then at least you'd be able to point to it and say, it says very clearly that you can't do this. So, I mean, you'll come up with some other explanation for why you can, but yours will be more convoluted than this says no. And as you know, if you have to explain, you're losing. So if you have to explain why the plain language of the law says this can't happen, you start out by losing. And that's helpful. Next up, clarify the safe harbor provision. So it's absolutely clear that if a state resolves its own disputes over electors by that deadline, Congress must count them. Again, they can vote to overrule. Clarify the vice president's role, for instance. That sounds like a good idea. So it's clear that it does not include resolving congressional disputes over electors. So all very similar. And, we only hope that it might actually work with these people. These are not partisan reforms, we are reminded by the subheader for the next section. Well-meaning Republicans should support such changes. These vulnerabilities are exactly what enabled Trump to exert tremendous pressure on various actors to help him corrupt the election. Reform would protect good faith Republicans from coming under such pressure again, since such a scheme would no longer be workable, maybe. This is why groups such as Republicans for Voting Rights support reforming the ECA, and why reform has the support of some right-leaning think tank types. What's more, there's no equivalence here. Democrats have at times objected to electors, that's true. Republicans who claim Democrats are just as prone to electoral shenanigans should want such reforms to safeguard against them. I guess, right, even if we think that, there's no real equivalence. If you do think so, then you'll want to prevent it from happening, right? It doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right. Former GOP Congressman Zach Wamp of Tennessee told me, noting that reforming the ECA has nothing to do with party politics. Updating the law is a nonpartisan way to avoid future crises. Yes, just in general. That's Nadeau. As for Democrats, if few or no GOP lawmakers are willing to support such reforms, they have the option of acting alone because, of course, they have a majority in the House, right? They could just Act alone. Democrats can't possibly want a scenario in which they end up failing to fix the ECA because they're unwilling to, say, end the Senate filibuster, and then something like this happens again and succeeds. Can they? Right, they can't possibly want it. Well, they don't want it, but will they, reform the filibuster in order to make sure? Because that's what it would take in order to get it done this time around. But, good point. Well taken. We'll return to this subject in just a minute or two. Hi, it's me, David Goldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. It makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, so we have concluded the Greg Sargent piece, and now we can read what Ira Goldman had to say about it. Although, as it turns out, I should always just read the article and wait until afterwards. But then I'm afraid I'll forget the points as they occur to me. But it looks like Ira's making essentially a lot of the same points, although he does approach it from a slightly different angle. And as I'm speaking, I'm scrolling through my own Twitter feed because there was another thing which didn't get parked in... there it is, and I found it too. Which didn't get parked in Pocket, but was also Ira making some observations about something completely different that is also very interesting, and I want to bring to your attention next after this. But first, we'll double back here and say, okay, so there was Greg writing this piece and then circulating, and Ira responding by saying, I guess I should remind you that what Greg tweeted was, a coalition of election experts is issuing an urgent call for reform of the Electoral Count Act. This is a critical way to safeguard against future stolen elections and maybe even another 1/6. And Ira responds, but that safeguard would be flawed. And now we go to the more formal restatement of what I was saying. Deschler's precedence says, that is the compilation of various, and is Deschler Senate precedents? I can't remember, but I think so. Anyway, Deschler's precedents. Says that the joint session, that is the joint session of Congress in which they actually read the messages from the states about their electoral votes and then verify the count and have the tellers and everything and then declare the winner based on the certificates that they got from all the states. Deschler's precedence says that the joint session in which they do this, the joint session procedures in the Electoral Count Act are in effect constituted as a joint rule of the two houses, i.e., an exercise of Article 2, Section 5 rulemaking authority, that portion where they have the prerogative stated that the two houses have their prerogative to set their own rules of procedure. So, because the Constitution allows that, Deschler's precedence informs us that at some point this was pondered, and the decision was that the joint session procedures outlined in the ECA are, in effect, a joint rule of the two houses, that they have agreed to operate by the strictures of the ECA. But it also means that, still standing out there is the original Article 2, Section 5 rulemaking authority, which also, standing alongside this thing, says, well, they could decide we want a different joint rule. or a different rule for how to conduct joint sessions anyway, and it's our constitutional prerogative to do so, despite the fact that up until this point, since whenever it was, 1887, we have operated as though the text of the Electoral Count Act constitutes our rules. We want to change that rule. In other words, he says the safeguard is flawed because of this, and it's an exercise of the constitutional rulemaking authority, and therefore they're not binding, which he illustrates with a thread that he includes here. And that thread is from January 2nd. Fun fact, while the Electoral Count Act sets rules for how Congress counts the electoral votes to thereby determine who won the presidential election, and while the ECA is indeed a law, the House and or Senate can choose to ignore those rules. But fear not, and he offers this thread, the following. Now, let's see. He begins by showing a screen grab of, I guess that. Well, let me read it. It's let's say it's, as an act to fix the day. Okay, so I guess this comes from the original Electoral Count Act of 1887, the title of which was an act to fix the day for the meeting of the electors of president and vice president, and to provide for and regulate the counting of the votes for president and vice president, and the decision of questions arising thereon, just by way of illustration. So fear not about the fact that they can override these rules at any given time. When House and Senate create literal new rules, they typically do so by directly amending their respective official rules and publishing them in their respective rule books, which he illustrates with screen grabs of those rule books. But they can instead create rules that have no greater authority than any other rules of the House and Senate by enacting them into law and having them codified in the U.S. Code, which is what they did with the Electoral Count Act. And so, while the Electoral Count Act has the authority of a statute as to everyone else, the provisions, that is everyone else in the world and in this country, its provisions establishing the rules of the joint session and the rules of the House and Senate when they meet separately to resolve objections, they are but rules of the House and Senate, and so may be changed like any other rules, which, is not that different from laws. Laws can be changed too. It's just that you can do it very quickly by a quick majority vote, and you don't have to go through all of the enrolling process and signature by the president, et cetera, to make it happen. So, where were we? They can be changed like any other rules. And here he illustrates it with the grab from the Constitution, which says each house may determine the rules of its proceedings. The fact that Congress-related provisions of the ECA are but rules helps explain why, despite the ECA saying the House and Senate shall meet in the House chamber at 1 p.m. on January 6th, why they don't just show up there and meet at 1 p.m. on January 6th. They do it pursuant to a resolution, right? So again, I guess by way of illustrating it, the Electoral Count Act says very clearly that the House and Senate shall meet in the House chamber at 1 p.m. on January 6th. And they do that. But what he's pointing out is they don't actually meet. They never say it anyway. They never say that they're actually meeting at 1 p.m. on January 6th pursuant to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. They instead adopt a resolution each year that they have to do electoral vote counting and say that they will do that. Now, I mean, what they might be doing in their minds is saying, well, in accordance with the Electoral Count Act of 1887, we hereby resolve to actually obey that law. But what has the effect of causing the reason they meet at 1 p.m. on January 6th each time is they adopt a resolution that says they're going to. That's the controlling mechanism here. Although I suppose if they didn't pass such a resolution, they could just go there and say, well, everybody knows that the Electoral Count Act says that we're supposed to do that. And yes, it's a statute, but it's also adopted into the rules of the two houses. So, we don't really need a resolution to do this. I mean, I guess that's my only objection to what Ira is saying. But they do pass that resolution, and so they do meet pursuant to those resolutions. Or, as the authoritative Deschler's precedent explains it, the joint session is convened pursuant to a concurrent resolution of the two houses, i.e. not pursuant to law, that is the ECA, which incorporates by reference, that is the resolution incorporates by reference the applicable provisions of law. So technically what they're doing in some of these resolutions, I guess they say, well, pursuant to the strictures of the ECA, we now resolve to meet in joint session in the House chamber on January 6th at 1 p.m. So they can contemplate the statute, and they're aware of the statute, and they might point to the statute, but it's the resolution that says we will act in accordance with the statute. And I guess implied in here is they could pass a resolution that says we're going to meet at 2 p.m. instead of 1 p.m. for whatever reason, either just out of defiance or maybe for a good reason. Anyway, Ira then says, to those following along, I'm laying out these background details as a lead-in to explain the sorts of unusual maneuvers various Trump supporters might try, starting as early as January 3rd, and the ultimately fatal impediments they will encounter. Remember, this is a thread from January 2nd, 2021, pre-insurrection. Anyway, again, the ultimately fatal impediments they will encounter, because I've found that a lot of folks, I've found that a lot of this is counterintuitive to both lawyers and non-lawyers, especially the notion that Congress may ignore rules of procedure even if those rules are embodied in a statute. So, ever since the ECA was enacted in 1877, I thought it was 1887, maybe it's just a typo, Congress has convened to count the electoral votes pursuant to a concurrent resolution, which, A, repeats the basic provisions of the ECA, sometimes verbatim, and, well, I think he's joking. 2, A and 2, as Deschler's puts it, incorporate the rest of it by reference. Now, you might ask, Ira, you've said Congress is free to ignore the provisions of the Electoral Count Act, ECA, but has that ever actually happened? Yes, it has. In 1893 and 1897, so pretty close in time to the adoption of the act itself. Despite what generally well-considered sources of basic facts have said, the vice president does not declare a winner. Rather, he announces the state of the vote, i.e., how many electoral votes each candidate received, and from that, we have to figure out who won. This may seem a minor point, but when Congress was considering enacting the ECA, it was a major concern of the House, which insisted that the election result be dependent upon the vote itself and not upon the judgment of the presiding officer. And here he includes a screen grab, a clip from the Congressional record of January 31st, 1901, the remarks of a Representative John Dalzell, a Republican of Pennsylvania, who said, in other words, in the law as originally drafted, it was sought to provide, after providing that the result of the count should be delivered to the President of the Senate, that he should be authorized not only to announce the state of the vote as it had been ascertained by the joint convention of the two houses, but that he should also, quote, declare the person or persons elected. The House struck out that provision so as to make the result depend on the vote itself and not upon the judgment of the presiding officer. You'll see why that becomes, you probably already see why that becomes important, because Republicans in this last election were saying, no, the vice president can just declare something different. Well, that was certainly not the intention of certainly not the intention of earlier houses, nor apparently that of the House and Senate, which drafted and adopted the Electoral Count Act. Now Ira continues, yet while the then newly enacted ECA told the President of the Senate just to announce the vote, as you can see here in 1889, the House and Senate agreed to a concurrent resolution that told him to announce the vote, quote, and the persons elected, unquote. And that's what he did. Same in 1893 and 1897. And let's see, what screen grabs has he got here? Here's the Congressional record, the clerk reading the resolution, I guess, by which they convened. Resolved by the Senate and the House of Representatives concurring that the two houses of Congress shall assemble in the hall of the House of Representatives on Wednesday, the 13th day of February, 1889, back in the old days when they did this a little bit later, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Later changed to January 6th. Pursuant to the requirement of the Constitution and laws relating to the election of the President and Vice President of the United States, and the President of the Senate shall be the presiding officer. That two persons be appointed tellers on the part of the Senate and two on the part of the House of Representatives to make a list of the votes as they shall be declared, that the result shall be delivered to the President of the Senate, who shall announce the state of the vote and the persons elected to the two houses assembled, as aforesaid, which shall be deemed a declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, and, together with a list of the votes, be entered on the journals of the two houses. Well, there you go. That's what the instructions were. What's this other grab here? They then did declare the state of the vote, and the announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate is, by law, a sufficient declaration that Benjamin Harrison of the state of Indiana is elected President of the United States. He highlights there for us. So that's what happened there. Ira continues. Now, as to whether the House just wasn't paying attention in 1889, 1893, and 1897, they were in 1901. That is to say, I guess what he's pointing out here is in the interim between the adoption of the act in 1887, and then the intervening presidential elections of 1880, I guess the year after them, right? So when they were counting the electoral votes in 1889, 1893, and 1897, they adopted resolutions that said that the President of the Senate, the Vice President, would declare the winner. By 1901, the House said, wait a minute, we've been doing this, we've been wording these resolutions incorrectly to this point, and we should just make it clear that the Vice President is simply declaring the state of the vote, and that's all. As to whether the House wasn't paying attention when they allowed it to go the other way, they were in 1901, and this time when the Senate sent over its concurrent resolution, the House amended it to follow the terms of the ECA. That is, don't announce the winner. The Senate agreed, and all went well. So here's a screen grab of the different resolution, whereas this time it says that the result shall be delivered to the Vice President or to the President of the Senate, who shall announce the state of the vote and the persons elected to the two houses assembled as aforesaid, which shall be deemed a declaration of the persons elected, right? And I guess that's the is that the Senate version of it, and then the House version is this other block? Well, very interesting. Or I guess they discuss the state of the vote and how the, oh, I see. This is the actual announcement from the presiding officer who follows the new rules and then says, the presiding officer's state of the vote for the President of the United States is delivered to the President of the Senate is as follows. The whole number of electors appointed, 447 at that point, 224 being majority. William McKinley of the state of Ohio has received for President of the United States 292 votes. William Jennings Bryan, state of Nebraska, 155 votes. The state of the vote for Vice President, whole number of electors, same 447. Theodore Roosevelt of the state of New York has received 292 votes. Adlai Stevenson of the state of Illinois has received 155 votes. This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons, but he doesn't actually do the declaring. That's the point. Okay, so let's see. The point here, thank you, Ira, is when Congress convened to count the electoral votes in the 3 elections after the enactment of the ECA, they followed the terms of 3 concurrent resolutions they'd agreed to, not the terms of that new statute, which may seem strange, but to Congress it isn't. What does this all mean for Ted Cruz, etc., et al., as he says here? First, if the House and Senate agree to a standard concurrent resolution that follows the terms of the ECA, what Cruz seems to be planning, e.g., a motion to suspend the joint session until an emergency 10-day audit is completed, that motion would be out of order. He'd offer such a motion in the Senate after an objection was made in the joint session and the joint session recessed to allow the House and Senate to separately vote yea or nay on the objection. His motion could only be in order, 1, by unanimous consent, and they're not going to get that, or 2, if a majority voted to allow it. Of course, the House wouldn't agree to do the same, but if somehow, it won't happen, but if somehow a Senate majority did vote to allow his motion and in favor of his motion, in theory, the Senate could refuse to convene until some sort of electoral commission did something or other. But, hang on, instead of waiting for January 6th, Cruz could launch his plan as soon as McConnell makes a motion to consider the joint resolution, or the concurrent resolution for a joint session, as early as January 3rd or 4th, one day after he wrote this thread, i.e. Cruz could have, back then, tried to offer an amendment to the concurrent resolution that would make his January 6th maneuver in order. And if McConnell wouldn't let Cruz do that, Cruz could filibuster the concurrent resolution. He says, I can't say for sure, but as far as I know, that's never happened before. And that would require McConnell to assemble 60 votes for cloture on the concurrent resolution declaring that the House and Senate will get together and count those electoral votes. Can you imagine that? Why didn't he think of that, by the way? An alternative approach. McConnell could call up a concurrent resolution with provisions, and remember he was still majority leader then, call up a concurrent resolution with provisions that would block Cruz and others from slowing the process. E.g., instead of each objection in the joint session being considered by the House and Senate for 2 hours each, the concurrent resolution could require batch processing of sorts, right? That was another way around it. You could have said, instead of voting on every single one of these objections, if they intend to make 20 of them, you can adopt a new rule that says we'll consider them all at once. With batch processing, any objections to each state's electors would, of course, all be heard in a series in the joint session, and then only after all were heard would the joint session recess so that the House and Senate could each separately debate and vote on them, e.g., in 1 2-hour session. Batch processing with just one combined debate and vote session would be an alternative to what the ECA calls for, i.e. each objection is followed by a recess and a separate 2-hour House and Senate debate, then separate votes. If Cruz and Hawley and House members object in the joint session to 6 states' electors, under the ECA, that would mean up to 12 hours of debate, i.e. into January 7th. While if McConnell could get 60 votes, he could pass a resolution that allowed the objections but would take way less time to resolve. McConnell could even go further and specifically craft a concurrent resolution with a provision requiring only 1 vote for all 6 objections, i.e. forcing Republicans to take only 1 roll call against Trump instead of 6. It would also have to, of course, make out of order any request for a division of that vote, but that's a separate issue, but true. Whether Cruz et al. Or McConnell are planning to futz with the concurrent resolution in any of the ways I've outlined, I don't know. Turned out they didn't. But I mention them because those possibilities mean the fun could start before January 6th, even as soon as tomorrow, January 3rd. Oh, what if Cruz did successfully filibuster the concurrent resolution past 1 p.m. on January 6th? Could the joint session still convene then simply on the basis of the provisions of the ECA? While as far as I know that hasn't happened since the ECA was enacted in 1887, I don't see why not. You just adopt new rules. An update from way back then, McConnell did not try to change the joint session resolution from its usual plain vanilla form to better block Cruz, while Cruz didn't try to change it so that his announced plan to delay the count for an electoral commission would be in order. All right. Well, this does go on for a little while longer about that, but just to jump back to where we were, remember, Ira was discussing the possible flaw in the election experts' call for a amended Electoral Count Act, right? All of that just could be thrown out the window by a majority vote. So he then went on to say, so a change to the Electoral Count Act would not provide a safeguard, but simply a new set of norms for the consideration and counting of electoral votes. So, that's a pretty big difference. And let's see, he includes here, I guess, Michael Anderson, I think, concurring with him. This is 100% correct, and generally the problem with using reforms of the ECA to prevent election stealing or subversion. That said, codifying revised standards would increase the normative salience of deviating from them to increase the odds of a public backlash. In other words, if you set the rules out and they break them in front of everybody, more people would either balk at breaking them and cooperating and breaking them and therefore balk, or more outrage could possibly, maybe, sort of, be sparked by watching them break all of those rules. Now, let's see. I mentioned that there was another thing. That's the end of this one. I just wanted to sort of lay that out for you. Just, again, the magnitude of the problem we're looking at here. That even changing the Electoral Count Act won't work all by itself against a determined bunch of wackos. But I've got a different thing that Ira points out, and we got just about 2 minutes to do it here. This I thought was very interesting. Where does this go back to? He notes in passing something that everybody missed here. When the House held votes yesterday, he's writing this on August 25th, so he's talking about August 24th. When the House held votes that day, Representative Peter, did we decide his pronunciation is Major or Meyer? I can't remember. Anyway, but you remember that he went off to Afghanistan the other day, and others, by the way, are still trying to do that. I got a wild story for you that we can share perhaps tomorrow about that. But you remember that he went off to Afghanistan unauthorized. Well, during those votes, he voted by proxy because, of course, he wasn't in the House, right? Which he was allowed to do, though, only by claiming in writing that he couldn't get to the Capitol due to the COVID health emergency. That's the only currently valid reason to ask to be able to cast your vote by proxy. Not, I wanted to go on vacation, or even I wanted to do something super serious in Afghanistan. But here the truth was, of course, he was on his trip to Afghanistan. So on August 23rd, he writes to the clerk of the House, an official document here, and says, pursuant to House Resolution 8, as it is, the one that authorizes you to miss votes and cast them by proxy due to COVID concerns, I write to notify you of the designation of a proxy to cast my vote. I'm physically unable to attend proceedings in the House chamber. He says, right in here, due to the ongoing public health emergency. And I hereby grant the authority to cast my vote by proxy to the Honorable Blake Moore of Utah. And guess what? That's a lie. And it's very clearly a lie. But nobody apparently called him on it except Ira. And weird. That is really kind of strange. Somebody then comments on this. Few, if anyone, prevented by COVID from voting in person now. Anyway, that's true as far as it goes. Ira says, that sounds right. But by the way, yesterday, and now we're talking about, again, the 24th, Nunes and Stefanik were among those voting by proxy. So I guess that lawsuit isn't coming back. I don't know what it was that prevented them from getting there, but you may recall that one or two or both of these two nudniks, Nunes and Stefanik, were suing to stop the House from allowing voting by proxy for whatever reason. But now they're using it. So I don't know whether their lawsuit isn't coming back or not, or whether they're just going to be hypocrites and are willing to go to court to sue to stop proxy voting and face the question from the judge, didn't you just do that? To which they'll say, yes, but I hated myself for it. To which we'll all say, we all hated you too, so we're in agreement on that. And now we can move forward and throw your lawsuit out. Anyway, two important pieces of news, that one of which took 25 minutes and one of which took 2. But thanks to Ira Goldman for pointing those 2 things out. Keep an eye on that. I wonder what will happen about that when people are on the record, in writing, lying to the clerk. Nothing, probably. Maybe they'll get an admonishment from the ethics committee. I don't know. We'll see you tomorrow. In the meantime, of course, Justice Putnam has the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy all ready for you. Coming up next, right here on Netroots Radio. That's our station identification.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
And thankfully, you'll be able to turn to Justice for news on this front. The January 6th committee has clapped back on Kevin McCarthy's attempt to whitewash the insurrection. And lots more, of course, from around the country and around the world, which if I began to read to you, I would only be cut off by the end of this here music right now.